Dornsife. And thanks to everyone for coming, to Unruh for helping set this up, to Dennis and Bob for all their hard work. Political science research has shown that judges' sentencing tends to be harshest right before lunch. I assume that similar patterns hold for political discussions. So my pledge to you is that we'll make up some time in the air and aim for a safe landing by 12:30, and hopefully won't have to throw anyone off the flight along the way.
Oh no.
So let me begin by introducing our very distinguished panel, which in the spirit of this conference combines some luminaries from academia with people who have really rich experience in the political world. So to begin, going again from left to right, not necessarily in ideological order, Matthew Kahn is a professor of economics, spatial studies, and environmental science here at USC Dornsife. Ron Klain is former chief of staff to Joe Biden and Al Gore and a former Clinton 2016 advisor. Ron Christie is a BBC political commentator and a former special assistant to George W. Bush. My colleague Jane Junn is professor of political science here at USC Dornsife, and Abel Maldonado was the 48th lieutenant governor of our own California from 2010 to 2011. So let me begin by asking a general question of all our panelists, and maybe we can just go starting from left to right, because I'm interested in getting everyone's take. General question. The Trump campaign was unlike any other in modern American history. I think we can all agree on that. So I'd like to begin by asking our panelists, since this is a panel on Trump at home, how have the first 100 days mirrored the unconventional nature of the campaign, or have they at all? In what ways has what we've seen from Trump broken with his predecessors sharply, and in what ways are they about par for the course, fairly ordinary for our contemporary politics?
So, very briefly, I'm an economist. Economists are used to being relatively powerful at Washington, and it's fascinated me and many economists I know that academic economists do not seem to be playing a major role in policy deliberations. And so that's a surprise to me. It might be a statement about our value added. And so something that I teach my students here is we can only know the effectiveness of a public policy if we have variation. So President Trump, by changing public policies, we're learning a lot about the effectiveness of public policies. We're creating a control group. But again, to an economist, these are very interesting days because there's a literature in economics about uncertainty, that investment can freeze up when there is uncertainty about where political winds are going. And President Trump, who's been a very successful businessman and is thinking about how to make the economy grow, I hope that he anticipates some of these unintended consequences of his policies.
Thank you.
You know, I think there are three things that have kind of really stood out from this period. I think the first is Donald Trump came to the White House as the president least owing anything to a major political party in 50, 60 years, most independent of both parties. He had an opportunity to really govern in a very bipartisan way. A bunch of Democrats traipsed up to Trump Tower during the transition. You know, people, even liberals in our party, were saying, like, we want to work with you on infrastructure. And yet he's governed as a very, very traditional Republican. He's allied himself very closely with Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. He, unlike either President Bush or President Obama, he didn't put a member of the opposite party in his cabinet. So I think the first surprise is how much of a Republican partisan he's been in his governing. I think the second thing that's really surprised me is how much he's really abandoned his economic populist agenda in these first 100 days. He started off with attacking healthcare, not infrastructure. He's re-stoked up some of these cultural wars around immigration, of course, but really hasn't delivered. On October 22nd, he outlined a 10-point plan of 10 things that were economically related. He tried to get done in the first 100 days. 9 of them he didn't even send to Congress in the first 100 days, let alone get done. He really hasn't tried. And the third, you know, personnel. Personal matters when you're president, and there's never been a modern president who's done less to try to staff his government in the first 100 days than Donald Trump. And that will have consequences if there's some kind of crisis, some kind of thing. I mean, as crazy and tumultuous as the 100 days have been, he's really been fortunate. He's been spared a major foreign crisis, a major domestic crisis. When something like that happens, he's going to find that the lights are out, nobody home in a lot of these agencies. That's going to be a problem.
Well, good morning, everybody. And I first want to start by thanking my friend Bob Shrum for the invitation to come out. It's always hard to say no to Bob, and so here I am. 3 quick points I think that really bear when you look at the first 100 days and kind of the similarities between the previous administrations and where we are now. For us, the Bush presidency, when we came in 2001, there were a lot of people who questioned Bush's legitimacy. There were a lot of Democrats who were very upset. Hey, we won. There were a lot of Democrats who were really upset by what had happened in Florida, and of course Ron and I both know this. I was down on one side, he was down on the other. But the first couple of months, the media made a lot of the legitimacy of President Bush, and of course you see that now with President Trump. The second, as the other Ron mentioned, that personnel is policy. My chief of staff, Andy Card, used to say that policy is personnel and personnel is policy. And one of the things that has really struck me by this White House for having been back into it and talking to the colleagues who are there is that there's nobody there, right? I mean, you walk in the White House and you see all these offices and they're dark. And there's new computer equipment there, there are chairs there are staffers that are waiting to be seated, but they're not there. And to put that into perspective, of the 16 executive branch agencies that we only have 2 deputy secretaries. And you wonder who's really doing the work. So the lights are off and the work's not getting done is something that I find really intriguing at this point. And the third point is this is obviously the Twitter presidency, right? I mean, Bushies are known for our discipline and known for staying on message, and I've never seen a president of the United States, and I don't think we've ever seen a president who takes to Twitter to go above the conventional media to get their message out. That certainly is pleasing to Trump supporters. It gives a lot of people undoubtedly in the communication shop in the White House heartburn, and it gives the media and all of us, of course, something to talk about.
So Morris, you asked the question of whether this is par for the course and the extent to which we can use previous presidencies as a frame of reference with respect to how this president is judged at 100 days or judged more generally. And I think that I would build on Ron's argument or observation about the uniqueness of this particular president, but within the context in which we live. All of us think these are amazing times because guess what? These are the only times we're living in, right? So had we been able to live in the 1800s, we would have thought those elections were amazing as well. Nevertheless, what we have now in the age of the communications technology that we exist in is that, as a student said to me, people say things because they want to get noticed. People do things just to get attention rather than wanting to be right, using facts, reasoning, or saying something useful. They instead say things to be noticed and to get attention. So I think in some respects, this particular change in the communications technology and the ways in which parties and the media have changed help to increase the extent to which a person and a personality of the president that we have now can either abuse this element of communications technology or use it to his advantage. Alternatively, the ways in which we're the same as we've always been is that there's always been polarization, right? There's always been partisan polarization. It has always been the case that anybody who's a Republican engages in motivated reasoning. Oh yeah, that's a good thing that he did. On the other hand, if it's a Democrat, it's a bad thing that the Democrats do. So motivated reasoning as well as confirmation bias have always existed. These are general, long-standing psychological processes. Those are no different. So the partisan polarization that we see, the distinction in differences of approval and not approval or disapproval by party should not be surprising to us. These are normal aspects of politics. But having said that, and turning back to the original point about the extent to which people today who want to be popular, who would like to get A's, say things to be noticed rather than because they might be true or not true. So I think it's useful to think about that within the context of a person who is not only the leader of this country, but who is the mouthpiece for his political party. And the significance of all of these statements, whether they're well-founded or not, based in reality, done at 3 in the morning, driven by whatever sentiment they are driven by, are nevertheless things that will continue to follow this president and this party, will continue to teach young voters, like our students, new immigrant voters. 20% of the U.S. population is immigrant or the child of an immigrant, as introducing to U.S. politics of this is how a president behaves, this is how a Republican president behaves. That's the lesson and one of the consequences of a communication strategy such as this.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I was asked to come and say a few words. Obviously, I come from San Luis Obispo County, and you guys had to dig deep to find somebody that would kind of talk about, in good term, for Donald Trump. And it's great to be here. I want you to know that as 20 years in public service myself, coming from the private sector, I've been watching what's been going on, obviously back in D.C. I've had the opportunity to meet President Trump. And it's not who I see on TV sometimes, is the fact of the matter. When I've one-on-one conversation with President Trump, he's very, very locked on the conversation, very, very smart, understands the issues, and somehow when he comes out of that office, obviously, it's a different person. And why do I say this? Well, I was a lieutenant governor with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I see a lot of the same. He is a businessman first, and you have to understand where he comes from. And when you see, we've heard earlier that there's a lot of positions that are vacant. Putting my businessman hat on and his businessman, I'm venture to guess that he sees that as savings for the federal government when it comes for resources. Luckily, there hasn't been a crisis, as we've talked, because that's when the rubber hits the road. But if you look at the president today, in his first 100 days, here's a man who was never, ever elected to office, ever. And you look at the previous president, President Barack Obama, obviously didn't have executive branch experience, but he was a state senator and he was a U.S. senator and he had experience. And you look at President Bush, he was a governor. And Andy Card was also an elected official at one point in time. He was a Secretary of Transportation, very well knowledgeable. And then you have President Trump, who comes into the Oval Office. He didn't have a transition team in place because I think they probably didn't think they were going to win. And so they come in fresh. He hires a chief of staff who doesn't have any government experience either. 45-year-old chairman of a party. And then you have some advisors who have been around him for a long, long time who have zero government experience. So I'm speaking as an outsider today because I'm not in office, but if I go to the parts store in my community, they love it. But if I come to Los Angeles and I speak to an institute, there's a lot of questions of why isn't this happening? But it gives you a flavor of the dynamics of what we have today. Now, if you ask me, well, what has he accomplished in the first 100 days? Well, he's nominated and got appointed a 49-year-old judge who's going to be there for 30 years or more. That's a huge accomplishment for him that he can tout for a long, long time. Now, people want to know about immigration. Immigration is one of my biggest issues. It's my passion. And I'm sad with some of the things that have been said. But I think there's an opportunity here to work on immigration. I think there's a lot of places where people are saying, well, he's trying to correct himself. Well, if you go back and look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, there's some similarities here. Let me share with you. Maybe you've caught on to this or maybe you have not. Most politicians want to be liked. Most movie stars want to be loved. And if you look at when Arnold was speaking, he would always talk in the third term. He'd say, when Schwarzenegger wants to do this. You never hear Mitch McConnell saying when Mitch McConnell wants to do this, or Nancy Pelosi saying when Nancy wants to do this. No. And when you listen to Trump, he says when Trump is going to do that. Bottom line, they're brands. Both are brands. And when the brand takes a hit, there's a correction in who they are. When Arnold got his brand hit, there was a correction. And I think President Trump is going through a correction. And I think Joel talked about earlier today about the base is worried he's going to go left. And that's the big point. That's the big question today that I think is where America's going to go. Do the Upper East Side New Yorkers come in and take over, or does he continue to tout to the base as I think you were talking about? He's been the president. It's just been for Republicans. So, kind of my feeling of where I'm coming from. I want to be the voice up here of the outsider who is not in office, who is a farmer, who's a viticulturalist, who is looking back and saying, maybe there is a change. And also as the author of Proposition 14 in California. Because I believe the biggest problem facing America today is the partisanship. And I think there is a hidden tax on partisanship. Because Republicans go into a caucus room and they worry about electing Republicans and not worried about the economy, and Democrats go into a caucus and they do the same exact thing. And we lose as the people of this great state and the people of this country. So we'll go on to other questions as well.
Thanks very much. And so a couple of the themes that seemed to come out of this were staffing, that it's fairly unorthodox. To some extent, in some offices, there's nobody home, period, and communication strategy. And so I wonder if I could ask, and I'm happy with any of the panelists jumping in on this, to what extent and how specifically have these two idiosyncrasies of the Trump administration maybe helped or hurt the president and in moving some of his signature agenda items forward? Anyone who'd like to jump in?
Well, on staffing, if you've got to look at the president first, this is a man who is running a multi-billion-dollar company with 30 people. And of those 30 people, probably a third of them were his family. And it's where he's coming from and where his trust is and where he feels, not understanding that the federal government is a huge, huge operation with some, I think I read the number of 550 people that need Senate confirmation that haven't even been nominated. Mm-hmm. That's a big thing that he needs to correct, and I think he will. Now, some people on my side of the aisle will say, well, it's the Democrats that don't allow him to do it. Well, no, he's got to nominate him. And then you have the Democrats saying, well, he's not nominating anybody, he doesn't have anybody qualified. Well, that's just both sides of the aisle trying to come. I think we're going to see some movement in the next month. I think he's been focusing on these 100 days. And to be frank with you, outside this room or maybe outside this city, I have never, ever heard somebody come to me and say, you know what, the 100 days are the most important days of a presidency. I think it could set the tone, but when his 4 years are up, they're going to judge him on what he did over the 4 years. But the staffing thing it's mind-boggling to some, but to some others, goes back to what you said. I mean, there hasn't been a crisis, so there hasn't been a situation where he needs to ramp up and move quickly. But it's a challenge, and I see him coming back to people that he believes that have some kind of a business experience that hopefully will help him. And then you appoint a secretary, and then the secretary might have a discretion on who the deputy is. Well, that doesn't work. When I was Arnold's lieutenant governor, we worked together. And if you don't work together, a Fortune 500 company doesn't work that way. So those are the challenges that I see as we move forward. And the staffing being a huge issue, I hope it's corrected soon, and I think it will be. I think, look, when we left Sacramento, Arnold told me something I'll never forget. Jerry Brown was sworn in. We had his beautiful ceremony. He said, I really like this job. But it took him 5 or 6 years for him to say that. President Trump's going to say the same thing. He's going to love this job. They love these jobs, these folks that are like them. But it's going to take some time. Right now, I don't think they're there.
Yes.
So let me try to put this in perspective for you, and Ron knows this very well. There is nothing more unusual than showing up to the White House on day one, because there's no instruction manual. There's no, this is how you are the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to the Vice President of the United States. You show up in your office, and there's literally nothing in your office except for a little band around your computer that says this is property of the GAO, and everything here will be recorded. That's it. And so as you try to sketch out how can I serve the president? How can I work with the vice president? If you don't have the personnel in place to carry out the president's agenda, you're in a very, very bad spot. And I look at this administration and I look at the president and say, you've got to stop the infighting. There was a fascinating article in the front page of the Washington Post that I largely believe from my friends who are inside the White House of there are different camps going on, right? You've got Ivanka and Jared in one corner. You've got Bannon in another corner. You've got some of my old holdovers from the Bush administration in another corner. And they're all signing off on the most minor of appointments. The President of the United States needs to have a position in place that allows the opportunity to get the senior people nominated, as the governor said, and sent to the Senate as soon as possible. But most importantly, to have those Schedule Cs, to have the political personnel in place in the agencies that can then take direction from the White House and fulfill the president's agenda. And I think he's being ill-served by his staff for that infighting. Ron and I certainly worked for very headstrong vice presidents and certainly presidents, but you recognize at the end of the day that it's not about you, it's about their agenda and what they're trying to achieve. And the infighting and the stories that you hear about that are really undermining and underserving this president. And as it relates to communications, certainly this is another area where his staff, I think, needs to pick up the ball and recognize, again, it's not about them, it's about the president. For us, we used to have message meetings 3 times a week. The first one, you talk about what we're going to do next week. The next one, you talk about what we're going to do next month. And the final one, we would talk about what we're going to do for the next 3 months. If you have an integrated communication strategy with a policy message, then the American people can actually understand what you're trying to accomplish. But when you are doing communications via Twitter and having the press secretary having to correct or amend or otherwise contradict what the president has just tweeted, you're in a really bad spot, and the news is then driving your message as opposed to you driving the news.
Yeah, I mean, look, I want to pick up with something the professor said earlier. This does feel like the Kardashian presidency, where, you know, he is desperate for attention, tweets out things that are patently untrue, and it's why in most of the polls, the 100-day marks, even Republicans say he's the most dishonest president we've had in modern times. He lies almost every day. That is not a good thing for a president. And even if some of those lies rally his supporters and appease his voters and are red meat for his base, ultimately erodes his credibility as president, and there will come a day when he will want that credibility, and it won't be there because he's squandered it on ridiculous things like saying that Barack Obama spied on him in 2016, okay? So I think that's one problem with this whole mode of communications he has. I do think the Governor Schwarzenegger model is a really interesting model. And frankly, I expected him to be more like Governor Schwarzenegger. And I think one thing Governor Schwarzenegger did was reach out to Democrats and try to govern in a bipartisan way. He understood this was California. He couldn't just do it with Republicans. He understood that he had to find middle grounds on some of these issues. And as I said at the outset, that was really what I expected Donald Trump to do. I expected a more pragmatic, business-like, bipartisan kind of thing in the model of Governor Schwarzenegger, in the model of Mayor Bloomberg in New York. I think there are a lot of models for that, and that's not the path he's chosen. Now, final point I want to make about 100 days, and this is where I agree with Lieutenant Governor. Look, the 100-day thing matters because it is a benchmark of sort, and in fairness, Donald Trump did tell people in the campaign, I will do these things in 100 days. He picked this standard. It was his campaign message. But it would be a mistake to conclude that because these things haven't happened in 100 days, he can't fix them. Anyone who has underestimated Donald Trump has suffered a price for that, a bad price for that. And I think that it is still in his power to change direction and to fix some of these things and to, you know, correct the course that his presidency is on. Will he do it? You know, I don't know that anyone knows. I don't know that he even knows. But you know, he still has 1,360 days to fix what went wrong in the first 100.
Thank you. Question following up on that for Abel, and then I'd like to go to Jane with this as well. Is Trump hurting himself and pushing his agenda by having maybe damaged his credibility in a variety of ways? I mean, there's the staffing issue, there are the reports of the staff infighting, there are the sometimes bizarre late night or early morning Twitter screeds. Is this hurting Trump as he goes forward, or is there maybe a method in the madness?
It's who he is. It's who he was before the campaign. Mm-hmm. It was who he was during the campaign. I mean, when people say, well, he tweeted at 7:30 in the morning because it was Saturday and he didn't have his caretakers around him. He's been tweeting at 7:30 in the morning for 6-7 years. Mm-hmm. How can I put this? He's learning on the job, and I mean, he might not want to say that, but he's learning on the job, and then soon he'll start, believe it or not, soon he'll start doing repetitions of, okay, here's the budget again. Okay, here's the deadline for this. And he'll start to get the hang of his job, and before you know it, don't underestimate him. I mean, don't underestimate what he's doing. I mean, it just came out right now, what, 30 minutes ago, that the Freedom Caucus is now supporting Obamacare repeal. Well, I'm not going to believe that till I see it, because I've served with Freedom Caucus members in Sacramento, and they'll say one thing, and when the vote comes up, it's a whole different ballgame. Because they have to go get a check off from a couple of lobbyists, just like the left have to go get a check off from some lobbyists and so forth. But I don't see it as hurting him. This is how Donald Trump, this is how President Trump operates. He's going to continue to operate. He's going to fix some things here and there. But at the end of the day, he is the nucleus. He's the one making the decisions. He's the one making the calls. And let me just share something with you. I'm in business. I've been in business before politics. And I remember, we're going to do this tomorrow. And guess what? We're going to do it tomorrow. Well, in government, the one thing that I think President Trump's going to learn real soon is that government was designed by our founding fathers to move really, really slow. It took me 8 years to figure it out. And you take little bites at the apple every year, and then maybe after 5 or 6 years, you get the whole apple, and you have some satisfaction on federal government issues and state government issues. And I think he will learn that, and he'll figure it out real soon, because he's very smart. The question is how soon, and when can we get some relief from some of this Twitter stuff that people think he's going to stop? He's not going to stop. Mm-hmm. Nope. He's 70. He's on Twitter. He's on Instagram. He's on Facebook. And he communicates, and in his mind, I don't know this for a fact, but in his mind, he knows how many readers the LA Times has. And in his mind, when he tweets something, he's getting more of his message than what the LA Times has. That's what I believe he feels. So he's going to keep going. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that he sees a tweet from somebody else that says, yeah, that makes sense. Boom, retweet.
So I'd like to bring Jane in here. And I guess maybe part of what I'm driving at with these questions is the difference between being loved, which most people seem to think President Trump wants, maybe even being feared, and pressing forward an agenda. Is there a method to the madness, and which of those aims does it serve? And are those aims in tension?
I've never met Donald Trump. I've not observed him, so I care not to draw any inferences about what his personality is, what drives him necessarily. But instead, I'm going to provide a different kind of an answer to that. And I'm a political scientist, so I'm not that involved in day-to-day politics, as you all know if you've taken my courses. So what I am involved with and interested in, it's not that we're not interested in day-to-day politics, but what we're looking for are larger and broader patterns. We're looking at systematic evidence that helps us to understand the significance of those actions. So as a person who studies political behavior and attitudes, the thing that we're trying to understand is what is the cumulative effect of this type of communication strategy, regardless of whatever his personality is, if he wants to be loved, if he's got some other complex because he was raised in a Bettelheim box, who knows, right? So let's leave that to the biographers. But in any case, the point of what we can do systematically as scholars and as students and as informed observers of politics is to try to understand what the longer-term implications are of this form of communication strategy, the intensity of it, as well as the tenor of it. And when Morris asked the question of will he lose credibility, of course the answer has to be given within the context of who are you talking about. So to fervent supporters of Trump, I would argue that it may help him, right? To people who are informed political observers, the likelihood that it will help him is relatively low. And this all emanates from the question and the perspective of what is in the content of those communications. So over time, if the president continues to provide commentary, such as the former president wiretapped him, or other elements that are equally as derisive, divisive, accusatory, or defensive, and to the extent that the media coverage about that only follows those, I think there can be a long-term deleterious effect not only on the image of the president and his credibility among his supporters, but certainly among people who are long-term, consistent voters. Those are the voters that are the most important in off-presidential year elections. They will be important in 2018. I understand we'll discuss this later on at the last panel of the day. But furthermore, also to the extent that we're talking about a re-election run for this president in 2020, which will start only in about 18 months. So one has to think about, in answering this question, who it is that we're talking about. And if and to the extent that the president decides to tweet other things that are potentially less derisive, less divisive, less accusatory, less defensive, it would probably be useful for people to cover that as well. I'm sure he tweets nice things. I'm sure he tweets congratulatory messages. Someone is analyzing that, I'm sure, at this moment. Nevertheless, the answer to the question and the inferences that we can draw based on systematic data have to be about the long-term consequences of it. What you feel today might be very different at the time 18 months have gone by and you're about ready to vote for the next president, or for that matter, senators or members of Congress who represent the political party of the president.
Thank you. I'd like to switch gears a little bit to talk about particular agenda items domestically for Trump. And I'll start with Matthew Kahn, and again, going off your comment earlier about the distinct absence of economists surrounding the president. I'd like to turn to a topic that seems to be on everybody's mind now, which is tax reform. And so the question I'd like to ask, beyond sort of what are the prospects for reform, and why has Trump apparently proposed something that seems to have, at least on its face, very little chance of making its way through Congress, at least unaltered? I'd also like to ask, what role would experts ordinarily play in the design of this legislation, and where do you see the impact of maybe those missing voices in the design and strategy of this particular piece of legislation? And I should offer as a caveat that I guess Trump was going to have a meeting on this today, so if there are any recent developments, I'm unaware of them.
So in the New York Times today, Arthur Laffer makes a comeback. I don't know if everyone's read their New York Times or is focusing on the Clippers' loss last night. And so Arthur Laffer and some forgetting the name for this group of economists, it was proposed that by cutting taxes, we could raise revenue. And so we're about to get another test of the Laffer curve. And at the basis of what economists know is that many of our social problems could go away if our economy could grow by 4% a year. As the baby boomers age, a series of entitlements issues, we could finance these. We could invest more in the poor and in our inner cities if the economy were growing by 4% a year. I think a fundamental issue that I don't know the answer to, and I apologize for my ignorance, I need to get a second PhD, is if there is the tax reform that President Bush is pushing for, will we get this macro stimulus? Because I think it will increase income inequality. But will we get the economic growth that is promised? And folks, this is a new age of humility from economists, or at least the economists on this side of the table. I know that I don't know the answer of what we would get from a tax cut. And so I think a very interesting question is, when you know that you don't know, when the experts know that they don't know what we will get from a policy, how do you proceed? If our goal is greater economic growth, I certainly hope we can achieve that goal. But the tax reform, to many macroeconomists, it remains an open question what we'll actually gain.
Maybe a follow-up on that for the two Rons and for Abel. How do you proceed when you don't know what you don't know, and on an issue like this? And where does this leave Trump politically, to be in this kind of position of not necessarily knowing the full consequences of these sorts of proposals, and is there any chance to get the sort of bipartisan cooperation on tax reform down the line that, that people have come to associate with, let's say, the Reagan era?
Well, look, I think you start with what you promised voters in the campaign. That is, I'm less interested in the core-based Trump voters who love his anger, love his outrage. They're for him. They're always going to be for him. But he won because there are a bunch of voters who actually disliked that stuff, but said they were willing to vote for him because they thought he was going to deliver change. And what I can tell you is there are virtually none of those working-class voters in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin who said that the most important thing I need the next president to do is to lower the tax rate for big corporations to the lowest number in the history of our country, okay? I doubt anyone showed up on a cold day in Pennsylvania in November to put this man in the Oval Office to make the centerpiece of his economic plan a corporate tax cut, okay? So, he promised the voters a middle-class tax cut. He promised he'd actually fight to get it passed in the first 100 days. He hasn't even put one forward. Government does move slowly, but I will say on day 30 of the Obama presidency, he signed into law a $300 billion middle-class tax cut on day 30 of his presidency. So it can be done. And I think something like that would have bipartisan support. But if his agenda really is a bunch of corporate tax breaks, big cut in the corporate rate, I think he's going to find a lot of fighting on Capitol Hill. Last thing I'll say on this, I think Democrats would be wise, and I wrote a column to this effect in the Washington Post, so I think this because I put it in the Washington Post. I think Democrats would be wise to call Trump's bluff on the link between the corporate tax cut and job creation. So if that's what he's really going to put forward, then the rule should be that if you're a corporation and you don't make a lot of new jobs, you lose your tax cut. If you're a corporation and you make more jobs overseas than you make at home, you should lose your tax cut. There are a lot of ways to hold Trump to his own standard about job creation as this tax reform debate plays out, and I hope that's something Democrats do.
I take a different tack at this, and I find it fascinating. Everyone's focusing on Donald Trump, the first 100 days, what's the president doing? And I look at this in a different perspective, and I say, this is the Ryan speakership, and this is the McConnell majority leader-led Senate. We have a Republican Congress. We have a Republican in the White House. What in the heck are they doing in Congress, right? So Paul Ryan, full disclosure, dear friend of mine, great guy. Sorry, Paul, if I'm going to upset you with this. Paul Ryan put together a plan called A Better Way last year. And this is what the Republicans ran on. If you go to speaker.gov, you can find this. And they talk about health care reform. None of that's in what President Trump is trying to do. They talk about tax reform. None of that is in what President Trump is talking about. And there's this rift that is starting to develop that is beneath the scenes and is yet not being reported by the media, but probably will be shortly, of the rift between congressional Republicans and the White House. And it's getting more and more pronounced. I had dinner with a good friend of mine who's a member of Congress from New York who told me, look, the Trump people don't come to talk to us. They come and say, you've got to pass a health care bill within the first 100 days, get it done. And they're not as interested in the specifics of what's in the bill. And the Trump people come to us now and they say, oh, we've got to get a tax bill done. We're going to put out our tax bill next week. And we're like, well, wait a second. We haven't even gone to Ways and Means Committee. We haven't marked anything up in Senate Finance. And so I think there's an interesting dynamic that's at play here with Donald Trump today by putting out his tax plan. It's almost like his shot across the bow of Congress of, you haven't acted, you haven't passed any legislation, now I'm going to use my bully pulpit to get you to act. So be on the lookout for how Republicans, it's those old cartoons when I was a kid, spy versus spy, now it's Republican versus Republican. See how they interact with each other and how they are able to govern or not govern.
Abel, would you like to jump in on this? I'm curious about, I guess, this kind of Republican versus Republican strategy shot across the bow. Is this a wise strategy as Trump tries to push his agenda, and is it something that we're likely to see more of going forward?
Well, the president's election is not for another 3 years, and all the Republican congressmen are up in about 18 months. Mm-hmm. So I've been a politician. I know what I'm worried about when I'm getting ready to vote on something. I'm worried about if my voters going to vote for me in about 18 months because I want to keep my job, because it's the best job I've ever had. So, yeah, I think we're going to continue to see that because they're very concerned. I mean, I think this race in Georgia woke up a lot of Republicans, and they said, wait a minute, if this guy who's not even living in the district can come close to winning, that means our message might not be great across America, so we're going to change our tune. That could happen. But if you go back and listen to Donald Trump during his campaign, I mean, do we remember his campaign? I do. I mean, the first thing out of the box was, we're going to repeal Obamacare. Yay. That was his message. And then he came back and he said, we're going to give a tax cut. He didn't say how big, but he said a tax cut. Yay. And then he came back and he says, we're going to repeal Obamacare. We're going to do a Supreme Court justice. You know, I'm going to be elected because I'm going to give you a conservative Supreme Court justice. And then he says, we're going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. And then he says, we're going to have $1 trillion infrastructure proposal. That was his message. That's why he got elected. So now he's coming back and saying, yeah, I mean, I don't know if the 15% tax cut's going to work. I mean, it's not going to work. If it doesn't work, it's because the Congress says no to him. Because he wants 15%, because that's how he operates. And he believes that 15% to corporations will allow them to start the generators and create all these jobs, and then all of a sudden we'll have all this income which we can fund all the programs like we were talking about earlier today, and that's what he believes. So the question is he going to work with Congress, and is there going to be some bipartisanship? I don't see it for the near future. Until there's a big failure. If you go back to Arnold, I mean, Arnold came in with the same message. If you remember his message, he was campaigning with a broom around the state, saying, I'm going to sweep out all these politicians out of Sacramento. And then he called them girly men. And then he came out and he said, we're going to eliminate the vehicle license fee. And he did, until he said, I'm going to take on the whole world. And he did his initiatives, and he took on fire, and he took on police, and he took on the nurses, and he took on every labor organization, and he lost. And that's when the transformation came into play in California.
So if I could follow on to that point a little bit, I guess from my extensive reading of The Art of the Deal, one of the signature pieces of advice is come in with a big proposal that goes beyond what you expect to get, and always be ready to walk away from the table. A couple of times we've seen Trump do what was once, I guess, unthinkable, which is to pull the plug on something, to back off. And we saw that on the repeal and replace of Obamacare, and we recently saw it in the negotiations to avoid a government shutdown, where it seems, anyway, that Trump has backed off the wall, at least as an immediate as something that he's insisting on immediately. Is this kind of strategy typical of going big and then, if necessary, going home on the issue? And what does it do to a president's bargaining position vis-a-vis Congress? Anyone can jump in.
Well, I'll start. I mean, you know, we expected an art of the deal presidency. So far, we've seen very little art and no deals. And so that's a big problem for him. You know, I think that, you know, he has to be a successful president, you have to get things done. It really is not much more complicated than that. And to get things done in Washington with problems with his own Republicans, with problems with the Freedom Caucus, with some difficult Democrats on the other side, you have to make deals. And so far, he's been unable to do that, unwilling or unable, but in the end, unable. And you know, that is something that he is going to have to change, or else he is going to rack up a no-accomplishment presidency, other than a few things. I think the Supreme Court justice thing is a big accomplishment, no question about it, particularly for his conservative voters. He obviously has foreign policy at his disposal and executive orders at his disposal. But in the end, to deliver the promises he made to voters in the campaign, he has to find a way to start to get some deals done. And he can't just keep on blustering big and then walking away. That's not a formula for success.
Let me echo and amplify that point, because the presidency, you have such immense power at your disposal to actually cut the deal, and using the power of the presidency to cut those negotiations off at a certain point and say, let's just get it done. And let me give you an example as it relates to President Bush. So his signature accomplishment for him was No Child Left Behind. He wanted to get No Child Left Behind through, a bipartisan effort to reform the education system in America. What was the first thing he did? First thing he did was call up then Senator Kennedy and say, what's it going to take for me to get a deal with you that you're going to co-sponsor my legislation to get this through the Senate and to obviously send something to the House? And he sat down with George Miller, congressman from California at the time, and said, Mr. Miller, what's it going to take for you to support my bill and to co-sponsor it and get this bill through the House? And the president was very wise of using the power of the White House, right? So what was one of the earlier things he did? He invited the entire Kennedy family over to the White House for a screening of the movie 13 Days before it came out to get some love from the Kennedys. He also renamed the Department of Justice after Bobby Kennedy once Ethel asked him to do it. And there's certain ways that a president can empower people through favors. Of course, everyone loves riding on Air Force One. But the art of negotiation is finding a way to break bread. And I think President Trump would be very, very well advised to sit down with Nancy Pelosi, to sit down with Chuck Schumer and say, where are some principles that we can all agree upon and move from there? Because it worked for us, it worked in the Clinton administration, and I think it could work for the Trump presidency.
Can I just say one very brief thing about that?
Yeah.
So Senator Kennedy's successor in the Senate is Elizabeth Warren. And in the first White House meeting held in this administration, where the president invited Democrats to the White House, he began the meeting by saying, I guess the face of your party is Pocahontas now. Okay? So racial epithet fired at Senator Kennedy's successor. That is not how he is going to get things done on Capitol Hill.
I just wanted to make one last point, and that is with respect to expectations given the structure of government today. So the structure of government with respect to party, who's in power. Now, previous presidents have worked under circumstances of divided government and a divided Supreme Court. In other words, under Republican administrations with a Supreme Court that's primarily conservative. In this case, and one way to think about the expectations for accomplishment, whether it's 100 days or the full 365 times 4, would be to consider the circumstances under which this president is operating. He has both houses of Congress by good majorities. He has the Supreme Court, and he also has nearly 3/5 of the state houses across the United States. So under the circumstances of a structure of government that is, relatively speaking, unified under the Republican Party, one could argue that the expectations for legislative accomplishment done through Congress rather than executive order should be much higher.
Thank you. Abel, is President Trump getting in his own way, and is he coming up short relative to the expectations?
You know, I think he's, like I said earlier, I think he's learning the job. I think he's learning where he's going. And I think if you look at, you know, we're talking about how George W. Bush did this in the first 100 days. He's a former governor. I mean, he understood this in Texas. And I think as time goes on, he'll start to get some victories. And I think eventually he'll get to the point where he'll understand either the hard way by losing the House, working with Democrats, or by a different way by saying, you know what, I got to work with some Democrats. We got to get this job done and start getting some victories. They might not be as big as I wanted, but we're going to get some victories because America needs to move forward. He's going to get there. He's not there today. I mean, obviously those comments in the White House, those aren't productive. And I'm sure somebody's telling him, Mr. President, that's not productive. And but it's just going to take some time. And I think one of the things that he's going through, look, when I got to Sacramento, it was 1998. And I don't want you to look at it, take this the wrong way, but we had some folks there, we called them the cavemen. They've been in office for a long time, and they fought like hell on the floor, but when the floor was over with, we were best friends, Democrats and Republicans. And you look at Washington today, everything is a fight. Everything is a gotcha. Everything is about party, not country. And he's dealing with that. And I think once he figures that out, I think maybe he'll say, you know, wait a minute, we've got to change some course here and get the job done. Either he's going to do it, or the American people are going to force him to by giving the House to the other party.
Mm-hmm. So let me follow up on that and just ask the panelists if they can, if they think they can identify let's say, one area in which President Trump has developed, grown into the role on the job, or if they think he hasn't in any way. So we can start from going from left to right again. Oh, excuse me. We have lost the panelist.
Yeah, we have lost the panelist.
I forgot to mention
He
that,
didn't like my comments.
Professor Kahn was going to have to leave midway through the panel. I apologize for that. Ron Klain, has he grown at all?
I mean, it's hard to see it so far. I do think that in the area of national security, it's the area where he has the strongest team. I think obviously putting in someone who was on Russia's payroll as your national security advisor was not a great move, but he's corrected that and now has, I think, a well-respected team, and he's certainly, I think, getting up to speed there more quickly. I think that'd be one area where you'd say, well, it looks like he's listening to some advisors. Looks like he's taking that seriously. But I mean, I am a little bit torn about this question that we're debating about whether or not he is going to change or he's not going to change. And you can't learn if you don't change. And so far, he's not really changing.
Ron, Christie?
I agree with Ron. I think the area that he has shown a capacity to really grow into his role has been in the national security and the diplomatic front. I think it was very important for him to establish a very good rapport with the president of China. Given how the North Koreans have destabilized the region and given their potential influence in that region of not only proliferating weapons of mass destruction, but actually deploying them, that I'm encouraged that the Chinese at least have been more supportive and open to the United States as a partner. Same thing with Israel. But on the domestic front, I think it's easy to criticize your predecessor in office about the use of executive power and the use of executive orders. And then once you get in that job yourself, you find, hey, I'm going to issue 32 myself. How about that in the first 100 days? And so I think the president needs to find a way to cobble together some legislative victories to prove that it's not just by executive fiat, but that he can work with the Congress to enact legislation. So he's got a long way to go, but I'm encouraged. I want him to be successful. I want him to succeed. I think you heard obviously some Republicans early on in President Obama's administration say, I hope the president fails. And if the president fails, the country fails. And so while Mr. Trump certainly has a idiosyncratic style, I think is the polite way to put it, I want him to find his way, and I want him to find his wings and his strength and to find a way to bring the American people together to get some accomplishments for all of us.
Identifying something he's learned. Maybe let's start with potentially the comparison between the first version of the executive order restricting travel from Muslim-dominant countries to the second version. You could argue that the use and the recognition of federal procedures, the use of the Justice Department, the use of a few lawyers was useful under those circumstances. So I would identify a relatively narrow one, both, by the way, of course, as you know, that there's an injunction against the second executive order as well, but you could argue that there's been some progress, if not in the president himself, then those around him in understanding what federal procedures are and what a constitutional question might be. Having said that, I just want to provide a response in a bit to some of what the lieutenant governor has said, that we shouldn't have high expectations. He's new, he's in the job, he just started, he was a businessman. I think to the contrary, I'd like to say that my position on this is not whether he succeeds or not, whether he gets an A or a D or an F perhaps, but instead after 100 days, but instead that as Americans, we should have high expectations of our president. We shouldn't say, oh, well, gee, he's a businessman and he's got kind of a wacky temperament. I mean, this is the most powerful political person in the United States and potentially in the world as well. The person has a responsibility for 300 million Americans as well as others. And in that regard, that responsibility should require high expectations, not low expectations, because the office has potential for tremendous good as well as bad. So I do think and I hope that the learning curve is indeed steep, not only for this president, but for his staff. But furthermore, that we should not give up and say, oh, well, you know, he's just learning. Well, he better learn quick, because this is a position for which all of us, whether we voted for him or not, he is the president of all Americans, not just Republicans.
Abel, before I give you a chance to to respond, I'd like to pile on and just point out that, that Trump himself, as a candidate, repeatedly talked as though he wouldn't need this kind of learning curve, that he alone could fix these things. He knew how the system worked.
Well, I'm speaking for myself as a person who came off a farm and became a state senator. It took me some time to learn, and I came in with the same message of we're going to run Sacramento like a business. Well, that's a great line. I said it at the time, and once I got to Sacramento, government does not run like a business. And it took me some time to have a learning curve. What I'm saying here is, when I say give him some time, I'm not saying give him 4 years. He's getting his ground. He's said it himself. He says my biggest mistake has been my messaging, not explaining. He said I'm giving myself a C. So just that right there tells me he's coming around. I mean, let's not forget, the American people had a choice not long ago to choose the most prepared person to take that job, who had all the experience to run that efficiently with all the experience, and they said no to her. They said yes to this man. So what I'm saying is that it's not that I'm going to give him all this time. He's been successful with some of the things that he's been doing. He's going to repeal Obamacare. It might not be how he said it. It's going to be repealed. It's going to be a tax cut. And if there's not, then guess what? Then I don't think he'll be there for 4 years. So he's going to make some changes. He's going to make them soon. And all I can say is that, there was, during the campaign, I was mind-boggled as well when Trump came on the scene. And I had heard a song by Bob Dylan. And it said, "Times, they are a-changin'." And I went back and read the lyrics. And let me tell you something, times are a-changing, and he is a product of times that are changing. He's going to learn quick on this job, and we're going to see some good things come out, I believe. And they're going to be bipartisan. They've got to be bipartisan. And if they're not going to work.
Thanks. Since we are in California, the heart of the resistance, I want to ask a question about how Trump's agenda has run into opposition in the states and in localities, and specifically on issues such as immigration and the environment and even marijuana. We see a lot of tension between the administration's objectives and what governors and mayors seem willing to countenance. How is that going to play out when push comes to shove? Who has the upper hand on these issues? And I'll start with Abel.
Well, first of all, I think President Trump has a tremendous opportunity to work on immigration. I said earlier that it's my passion. My father came to America in '63 as a bracero. He crossed the border with a penny in his pocket looking for a better life. His son became the lieutenant governor of California. The system worked. So I know that some of the messaging of the wall and that hasn't helped, but I think he's in a tremendous opportunity. If he can work with the Republicans in the majority, the Senate and in the House, we can get an immigration system in place that works. I mean, obviously, we're not going to get amnesty like President Reagan gave us, but and we talked about executive orders. Look, executive orders, he likes them because they're victories, but that's not the way to govern. So he needs to bring Democrats together to get some kind of an immigration system that works. I actually believe that we should have a temporary executive order to allow farm workers who are not criminals the opportunity to stay here on a work permit to harvest these crops that we all love in our country, and maybe for some hospitality and so forth. But I think we can do it. It's just, it's a matter of time.
Jane, who has the upper hand on immigration when it comes to some of these issues around sanctuary cities and the like?
Well, I mean, it all depends. I think that we were just studying about this in one of my classes. I mean, the concept of plenary power provides, which is articulated by the United States Supreme Court in, interestingly, Chinese exclusion cases of the 19th century, specifies that the federal government really has sole power in discretion over policies that are about immigration and naturalization as a function of national sovereignty. Having said that, questions of abode policies, how it is that we live once we're here, those are traditionally the realm of the state. Do you provide in-state tuition? Do you provide for college, for example? Do you provide the ability to get driver's licenses, housing laws? All of these abode policies are in many ways, a function of how it is that states themselves decide within the context of their own political cultures and economies, for agricultural workers, for example, and others, they should persist. And I think with respect to a president whose philosophy is to take regulation out, it would be ironic indeed if, in fact, a Republican president persisted in altering how it is that states create policies for abode, not for entry, but for abode. Within the context of entry, it is, in my view, I think in most people who study the federal government and know it, the purview of the federal government in this case. The interesting observation, however, is those executive orders on immigration have not been victories. In fact, they have been failures with respect to the courts, and to the extent that the Trump administration intends to litigate this further, it will remain to be seen whether the Supreme Court will hear and grant cert to this particular set of cases. At issue here with respect to plenary power is only the circumstances under which violations of individual rights are a function of those executive orders. But within the context of immigration policy, it's usually the federal government has the power on entry and on naturalization. So I would expect that to be the case. The question for anybody who studies Congress in the afternoon would be, and who observes Congress, is the extent to which Trump can put forward an immigration policy that is both comprehensive and palatable to both parties. And I remind you that it has been 20 years since the last major immigration reform, and that is the 1996 law. So it's been quite some time, and there have been other presidents perhaps more skillful in negotiating with Congress precisely because it is such a difficult issue.
Thank you. Any other remarks from our panelists before we go to Q&A on this or any other issue? All right, then I guess we'll, well, sure, we'll start taking questions from the audience.
There we go.
Yeah. I think we're going to have we have a microphone coming around, I think. Oh, there it is. So hold off for 1 second. Please.
I read as extensively as any human being can. I read the New Yorker, which is a leftist. I read the Wall Street Journal, which is right. I read the LA Times, which is completely unbiased and wonderful. I read the Christian Science Monitor, which is the most unbiased reporting in the world. And yet, I wait to see who among the politicians or the journalists is going to ask the most important question of all as far as Trump's personality is concerned. What causes this intelligent man to make such stupid, constant remarks? Is it up to a psychiatrist to write a biography telling us what's going on here?
Jane, I'm afraid you're the closest thing we have to a psychologist on this panel. Would you?
Well, I don't know. I'm not. I know that there are groups of psychiatrists who have suggested that presidents be evaluated for their stability. But let's not forget there have been plenty of other presidents that people during the time in which they were serving felt were unstable. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Woodrow Wilson was right up there in the crazy department. So there are plenty of potentially, and prior to that, certainly as well. So this wouldn't be, even if you were to go in that direction, to wonder whether or not there was a disconnect between level of intelligence and capacity to reason and then decision making. That isn't necessarily a function only of the present occupant. that there may have been, prior to this particular president, a series of pretty level-headed human beings running the government. Having said that, all we need to do is look to Watergate. We just need to look back to, I think in particular, John Dean gave some very interesting commentary on the nature of, or not the nature, the kinds of conversations that were had in the White House that were unfortunately taped for Nixon at that time. But nevertheless, the notion that you might get this disconnect between personality and rational reasoning, I think is, I don't know that it's uncommon. I think it just happens. You probably know a lot of people who are capable of flying off the handle or saying things that they might regret later. They just don't occupy the office of the presidency. They might be your uncle or your cousin or something. But it's not, I wouldn't say that it's an uncommon trait. And it is, as Lieutenant Governor said, a trait that people embraced. The American voters did, in fact, embrace that element of his personality. At least some of them did. So I'm afraid I can't. David Lauder maybe could ask this question and pose this question to psychologists or potentially to other political observers as to whether or not he is, the extent to which the personality that he's displayed is will be useful or not useful to him and the country in governing.
I'll use the chair's prerogative and just ask a quick follow-up to Ron Klain and Ron Christie about this. To what extent do we get a reasonable indication of the president's personality from what we see, let's say, in the media, and to what extent is there a very different picture behind the scenes? Not that this would necessarily pertain to Trump, but in your experience.
Well, I do think there are presidents who are different in private than they are in public. I'll say, not a president. One great example of this is Al Gore, who people who know him, Ambassador Emerson's here, know that actually he's kind of a funny, warm, likable person in person, even though he had a public reputation for being very stiff and robotic in public. But with Trump, I honestly don't care if he's crazy like a fox, like what it is. I care about the performance. And right now he is not performing as president. And that is the bottom line. And whether or not that's because of, something inside him, or because he wants to be loved, or because he wants attention, or because he's narcissistic, or all the 1,000 pop psychology things that are being thrown around, in the end, there's a bottom line here at performance that he's not meeting that bottom line standard.
I was always fascinated looking when we came in on day one of, George W. Bush as the amiable dunce, Dick Cheney as Darth Vader, who's actually calling all the shots behind the scenes and everything. And you get in the Oval Office and you recognize how powerful the president is in his command of the facts and his command of the staff and of his cabinet. And one of the funniest stories that I love to share is an early cabinet meeting, and everyone thought, oh, well, Colin Powell, he didn't run against Bush, and Powell's gonna kind of got an upper leg on him. I remember being in the cabinet room, and President Bush, being early for him was being about 10 minutes early. So if a meeting was supposed to start at 8, you better get there at 7:45, because if he hits the door and you're not there, he might lock it. And in this particular instance, that's exactly what happened. We had a cabinet meeting, everybody was there. The president walks in and said, "Where's Secretary of State?" And they said, "Mr. President, he's not here." He said, "Lock the door." And that was it. And then about 5 minutes later, you heard this. And Bush let him knock for about another 30 seconds or so. And he said, "Open the door." And he looked at him and said, "Colin, don't ever be late again." And so the impressions that you have of a president, of how the public perceives them through the media and what they're like when you work with them, it's something else. And as it relates to Dick Cheney, I would have to say I can't think of a funnier boss that I've had with a more wicked sense of humor than him.
Thank you for illuminating why Bush and Powell didn't necessarily always get along later in the administration. Other questions? Yes, in the back.
Thank you very much for having this conference, especially 100 days. First 100 days is very important. Thank you very much. You have the wisdom vision. Anyway, if I may have less than 1 minute, when the Donald Reagan campaigned for it, he was opposed by everybody, even ridiculed by his own party leader. But he endured through and won the presidency. So I said, wow, he's very presidential. So I voted for him. But after he became a president, first 100 days, it's a little disappointing, So I want Anthony's special advisor to the Donald Trump, be a man of president of the people, by the people, for the people, as Abraham Lincoln said. During the president candidate, no candidate said of the people, by the people, for the people. I was very disappointed. Anyway, yeah, first 100 days is time to study, meet the people, listen to the advice or whatever. And after 100 days, he should have said, I have studied enough. Now it's time for action from now on. He should have said that. So if he doesn't become a president of the people, for the people, by the people, I have to say second term, I have to say to him, adios. Thank you.
Thank you. Abel, I guess one question that come from that is, to what extent is Trump kind of following in the footsteps of someone like Reagan or someone like Governor Schwarzenegger? To what extent are these hiccups and this sort of learning curve to be expected? You said that they are, but in what ways maybe also is the experience that we've had so far different? And in that vein, has Trump maybe moved too quickly on some things when he should be taking stock and learning and trying to work behind the scenes?
I think he has, and I think it's because of who he is and his business background. I think the travel ban was written up quickly, and it was put out, it starts at the top. I would say it came from him. I want it out by this day. It's got to get out. I've done that myself when there was an initiative that I was working on, AB 109. I said, hurry up, we got to get this done by this day. It was a mistake. I made a mistake. We put some folks out that really weren't part of AB 109. So it's just a learning curve. And I don't want to go back to say, well, we elected somebody that shouldn't have to learn on the job and blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, I think give him some more time. I think we've got 3.5 more years of him. Okay, whether we like it or not. And I think we'll start to judge him after about a year or two to say, okay, he's getting in his groove. We're going to get some action and forward. But I went through Arnold. I don't remember Reagan. I was too young, but I went through Arnold. And Arnold at the end, you know what, whether you liked him or not, he understood the process, understood the legislative process, and we got a lot accomplished. And it was bipartisan at the end. And look, he became a big climate hero. He didn't start that way.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Look, I think there are some things that are involved in learning the job. I agree with the professor's view that it's a little scary to have a president learning on the job. But some of this isn't about, let's just be honest, some of this isn't about learning. It's about a core agenda of hate and division that he ran on through the campaign, that he is governing on as president, that has nothing to do with him getting more expertise and more learning. The day he launched his campaign, he said that Mexico was sending rapists and murderers to this country. That was day one. And every day thereafter, he has put a big "not welcome here" sign in front of this country and made that the centerpiece of a lot of his domestic agenda. And if you believe, like I believe, that immigration is something that makes this country great, that's what makes this country a world leader, it's what makes our economy vibrant and vital, it's what makes great stories like the Lieutenant Governor's personal story. It's what creates our cultural strength and our leadership around the world. Then he has been wrong-headed from day one, and he is showing no signs of backing off that. And indeed, we're already seeing not any backing off of that, but indeed a doubling down and a doubling down on it. And so, you know, I think that's not a question of staffing or learning. It's a question of perspective. And I think a lot of what's going wrong with the Trump presidency comes from that. Some things can be learned, some things can be improved. I hope he does. But some things are just wrong, and he continues to pursue the wrong things.
I'll give Abel a chance to respond quickly to that, if you'd like. Is this basically the agenda and the legacy of the first 100 days? Is it a not welcome sign and sowing hate and division?
Well, I didn't see the poll that was put out this morning. Unfortunately, I didn't see it, but I think I heard somebody when I sat down saying that one of his positives of that poll is that people believe he's keeping his promise. I mean, that's what the poll says. He's keeping his promise. So he's doing what he said he was going to do. Now, some people are never going to like what he promised and never going to like what he's going to do. But I'm going to go back to this learning curve. I don't want to say that we put somebody in that has no clue about government. I mean, you got to remember, at the end of the day, he worked with government on certain issues. He just didn't govern. And the governing part is where it gets tricky. And I'll repeat it again. Government was designed to move really slow. And when you move fast, you make mistakes. So I see good stuff coming up on the horizon, and it's going to be good stuff with Democrats. I think Chuck Schumer's going to work with him. They don't want to be sitting there for the next 2 years doing zero. On the words of division and hate, I mean, I'm not happy with some of the things that he said. I mean, he's actually said, he said it himself. I wish I could explain myself a little bit better sometimes. I say things that sometimes don't come across well. He said that, and I'm going to give myself a C. So I have some hope. I love my country, and look, we've gone through presidents, and we're going to go through many more presidents. I still have hope that there are some great things coming abroad, and I can say this. The people of our country, maybe not in Los Angeles and California, and maybe not in New York, but a lot of people in our country voted for change and voted for him. And they said, we want a new direction. So let's give him a little shot at this new direction. And guess what? If he doesn't do a good job, there's an election in 3 years, 3.5 years, and maybe things will change. I don't know.
Thank you.
Maybe one of the students.
Sure.
There's a student. He's already gone.
Oh, you asked a question in the last panel.
He did.
No, that was him.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, thanks y'all for being here. Something that's been coming up a little bit was the notion that there are good people advising Trump, at least in the foreign policy sphere. I can't help but notice that while it seems that some of the advisors at the top level are pretty top-notch, there's nonetheless still the fact that there are hundreds of appointed positions that have been unfilled. There's a lot of work that seems not to be being done. My question, and particularly to Mr. Maldonado too, but everybody, I'm curious on hearing your thoughts on this, is as the 100 days closes up and as those other spots get filled, can we start to expect a little bit more continuity in the administration's messaging and policy administration? And can we expect for there to be kind of a return to normalcy of sorts as more experienced professionals get into government in the appointed positions in the administration?
Thank you. And let me just ask the panelists to keep their answers brief so we can work in one more question. Sure. Thank you.
Yes, the answer is yes. And I think every day is going to be a better day for President Trump, and he's going to get better every day. And when he feels his administration, I think every day will be better policy days. And in the next year, we'll see a complete difference than what we have today. So,
I guess we'll have to hold you to that, Abel, to see in a year whether there's been a complete difference. I think one of the most interesting elements to this, the question of change and the relationship between change and the desire for change, and the idea of then repopulating the federal government with experts, with people who are competent, with people who have knowledge. And that seems to go without saying that we would want experts, whether they're on security or particular locations of the world, or whether they're scientists. But at the same time, there seems to be a swell of discontent among voters, particularly Trump voters, against those very experts. And I think that creates a significant tension, not only in the question of whether we're replicating the way the federal government ran before, or whether he's going to change it. That remains, I think, an interesting question 1 year later.
Well, to answer your question, of course, I think in a year from now, it'll be much better and much smoother. And you can look no further than the first executive order as it relates to immigration, right? I mean, they did not have the people at the Justice Department. They did not have the right people within the White House. They did not have the vetting system that should have been in place of a order of this magnitude, particularly given the topic and given some of the things that the president had said on the campaign trail, that it should have been vetted much more carefully. So I do share the Lieutenant Governor's optimism that in a year's time, when you get some very bright people in positions and they know what they're doing and they're staffed up, that they will guide this country in a much more smooth manner than what we've seen thus far.
Well, it's hard to imagine it getting worse. So I suppose in that sense, it has to get better. But I mean, it does matter on who he picks. I will say, you know, like he's picked some good people. He's picked some horrible people too. And, you know, I think it's just, and mostly he hasn't picked people at all. So it's kind of hard to know what it's going to look like once he starts picking more people.
Thanks. One more question? Yeah, in the back. No. Trump 2016. Yeah.
Hi, hello. So obviously I support Trump by the Trump 2016. And my question goes, as the poll you indicated, most people are happy with him so far, at least the people that voted on him. I feel so. People feel that he's keeping his promises. I see the other side saying he hasn't accomplished everything he said he would in the first 100 days. What if he accomplishes those things in the first 200 days or in the first year? Will the esteemed speakers change their narratives if he actually is able to accomplish what he promised, even though you might not agree, but he promised in the first 300 days or 1 year? Thank you.
Thanks. Start with Ron Klain.
Yeah, obviously my assessment would be very different if he accomplished the things he said he would do. Some of those things I would oppose still, but I would have to give him credit for doing them. I think the most striking thing is he hasn't even tried. He said he would pass 10 bills in the first 100 days. He didn't even send 9 of them to Congress. If you don't even send them to Congress, you can't get them passed. That's like a big problem. The last thing I would say about this, though, is some things he promised, you know, he promised not just to repeal and replace Obamacare. He promised that everyone in the country would have insurance, that it would be less expensive, and it would be better coverage. And if he delivers that, I will come back here a year from now and give him a big bouquet of flowers. But I promise you, no matter what happens with the Freedom Caucus, he is not going to keep his promise that everyone will have insurance, it will be less expensive, and it will be better coverage, because nothing he's talking about will do that.
Thank you, Ron.
You know, I remember a president who said that if you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan. If you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and we're going to cut costs by $2,500. And I don't remember the same sort of media attention of President Obama not keeping his word and keeping his promise there.
There was plenty of media attention on that, my friend.
Oh, no, hang on a second. So to answer your question, it was fascinating looking at the front page of the USA Today that they interviewed 24 Trump supporters, and 100% they think the president has done exactly what he said he was going to do. And where I think that Ron and I would agree on this is that you're not just playing to the loyalists, you're not just playing to the base. You're now the president of the United States, and you have to govern for all of Americans. And people are very, particularly in my beloved California, very concerned that he's only governing towards Trump supporters. And there needs to be a recognition by his White House staff that the campaign's over. It's time to govern. The campaign's over. And yes, you've got promises that you've made. And yes, you've got to obviously have an accountability with the American people, but let's govern. And so, and again, I want him to succeed, but he has got to move beyond promises to his base and to promises to the American people.
Jump in quickly.
Well, you know, if you go back and you look at presidents, Barack Obama will be known for the Affordable Care Act. He'll be known for the bank bailout, which was done with bipartisan support. He'll know about the first 150 days, his bill. Bush will be known for No Child Left Behind, and you can go on. This president is going to be known for either a big reform in taxes. He's going to do something in the next year or two that we're going to identify with. Is he going to commit to everything that he said? I mean, no president gets everything he says during a campaign. So he'll get around the edges a little bit here and there. But he'll be a different man in a year. And I think, you know, like that poll said, I think he's keeping his promises. And there's still, I walk in, yesterday I'm in Santa Maria. There's a gentleman parked next to me with 2 Trump flags in an area that did not vote for Trump. And I says, how's he doing? I mean, it's part, and then you turn on, and I was a CNN watcher. I'm still kind of a CNN guy. There is not 1 second that goes by they don't beat this guy up on everything. Even when he does okay, they're beating him up. So I think people are going to give him a shot. You obviously are going to give him a shot, and I think he's going to be a different president in about a year, and he will accomplish a lot of the things that he wants to do. And it's either going to be bipartisan because he wants to, or it's going to be bipartisan because the American people are going to force him and give him a Democrat House. So I think that's going to be what's going to happen in the next 18 months.
We have confirmed the political science finding that tensions rise right before lunch. Thank you very much to our panel and to all of you for your great questions. Enjoy your meal.